Everything Prince Harry complained about? Being the spare, being controlled, being told who to love, being punished for independence, happened to Princess Margaret 50 years earlier. The difference? Margaret didn't have Netflix. Margaret didn't have Oprah. Margaret didn't get to leave. She stayed inside the system that was crushing her, followed the rules that destroyed her happiness, and died without ever escaping. And nobody made a documentary calling her brave for it. When Harry's memoir Spare landed in January 2023, it became the fastest-selling nonfiction book in recorded history. 400,000 hardback copies on day one in the UK alone. The title was a single word designed to detonate, a grenade lobbed at an institution that had, according to Harry, treated him as an insurance policy since birth. And the public responded as though they were hearing something entirely new. A royal daring to name the dysfunction. A prince pulling back the velvet curtain. But here's the thing. They weren't hearing something new. Not even close. The story Harry told, of a life defined not by what you are, but by what you aren't. Of love denied because it embarrassed the institution. Of being forced to choose between personal happiness and royal duty, had already been lived, in full, by a woman born in a Scottish castle on the 21st of August, 1930. Her name was Princess Margaret Rose, and the system didn't just constrain her, it consumed her. So before anyone calls Harry a pioneer, let's talk about the woman who walked this road first. Without a memoir deal, without a single sympathetic interview, without any way out. To understand what spare actually felt like, not the word, but the daily lived experience of it, you've got to start in 1936. Margaret was 6 years old. Her uncle, Edward VIII, abdicated the throne to marry Wallis Simpson, a twice-divorced American. And overnight, Margaret's quiet, unremarkable father became King George VI. The family was yanked from their comfortable house at 145 Piccadilly and deposited into Buckingham Palace, a building so enormous and drafty that Margaret's mother reportedly said it felt like living in a museum. And just like that, Margaret's elder sister Elizabeth became heir presumptive to the British crown. Margaret became the spare. Before the abdication, the two girls had been practically interchangeable, a matching set. The American ambassador Joseph Kennedy noted in 1938 that they were dressed identically in rose dresses with checked blouses, red shoes, white socks, and coral and pearl necklaces. Same outfits, same governess, same life. But the abdication cracked that mirror in half. Elizabeth was pulled toward constitutional training, state papers, instruction from the vice provost of Eton. Margaret received none of this, because there was nothing to prepare her for. She had no future role. She had all the constraints of royalty, the security, the press attention, the prohibition on ordinary employment, the suffocating expectation of propriety, and none of the purpose. Their father, George VI, adored both daughters. He was widely quoted as saying Elizabeth was his pride and Margaret was his joy. Sounds lovely, doesn't it? But sit with it for a second. Pride implies responsibility, legacy, consequence. Joy implies entertainment, lightness, something you enjoy rather than depend on. From childhood, in the gentlest possible language, Margaret was being told she was delightful, but inessential. And then came the coronation. Not her father's in 1937, though that formalized the dynamic. Elizabeth's. On the 2nd of June 1953, 27 million people in the United Kingdom watched the first coronation ever broadcast on television. Elizabeth took the oath. Margaret, 22 years old, sat in Westminster Abbey and watched her sister become the most powerful woman in the world. She sat. She watched. That was her job. And that's when something happened that would define the rest of Margaret's life. Something so small that most people in Westminster Abbey didn't even notice it. But one journalist did, and it changed everything. As the coronation guests gathered outside the Abbey, Margaret reached up and brushed a piece of lint from the uniform of Group Captain Peter Townsend. A tiny, instinctive gesture, the kind of thing a woman does when she's in love and has momentarily forgotten that the whole world is watching. The press seized on it immediately. Peter Townsend was a decorated Battle of Britain pilot who'd been appointed equerry to King George VI in 1944, essentially a senior aide in the royal household. Margaret had known him since she was a teenager. By the early 1950s, when she was in her early 20s and he was 16 years her senior, they'd fallen in love. Townsend was intelligent, gentle, self-effacing, and by virtually every account, genuinely devoted to her. He was also divorced. That single fact, divorced, proved more powerful than any feelings either of them held. And the machinery that crushed their relationship wasn't a single decree from a single person. It was a series of interlocking gates that closed one after another with bureaucratic precision. Gate 1. The Royal Marriages Act of 1772, which required any descendant of George II under 25 to obtain the sovereign's consent before marrying. Elizabeth was now the sovereign. She was also Supreme Governor of the Church of England, a church whose doctrine at the time held that Christian marriage was indissoluble. Approving her sister's marriage to a divorced man would put the Queen in direct conflict with the institution she was supposed to lead. Gate 2. Prime Minister Anthony Eden and his cabinet made clear the government wouldn't support the marriage. The Commonwealth Prime Ministers signaled the same. Gate 3. And this was the one nobody would say out loud, but everybody was thinking. It had been barely 17 years since Edward VIII had ripped the monarchy apart by choosing a divorced woman over the crown. The establishment was terrified of anything that looked like a sequel. Margaret's love wasn't merely inconvenient. To the people who ran the system, it was an existential threat. So they did what institutions do when they identify a threat. They neutralized it. Townsend was transferred out of the royal household and posted to Brussels as an heir attaché. Exiled, in everything but name. Margaret was told to wait. If she could hold on until she turned 25, the Royal Marriages Act would no longer require the Queen's direct consent. Theoretically, she could marry whomever she chose. She waited 2 years, 2 years of separation. 2 years of letters that may or may not have arrived. 2 years watching from inside the gilded cage while the man she loved was stationed in another country at the explicit direction of the people who controlled her life. And when she finally turned 25, on the 21st of August, 1955, the final gate slammed shut. Parliament made clear that if Margaret married Townsend, she'd be required to renounce her royal title, surrender her civil list income, and leave the country for a minimum of 5 years. The establishment wasn't saying no. It was saying, you can have your love, but it'll cost you everything you are. For a woman who'd been raised inside the institution since birth, who had no career, no independent wealth, no life outside the palace walls, those terms weren't a choice. They were a threat. On the 31st of October 1955, Princess Margaret issued a statement. It remains one of the most quietly devastating documents in royal history. She said, "I would like it to be known that I have decided not to marry Group Captain Peter Townsend. Mindful of the Church's teaching that Christian marriage is indissoluble and conscious of my duty to the Commonwealth, I have resolved to put these considerations before any others." Read those words again, slowly. She didn't say she'd stopped loving him. She didn't say she agreed with the ruling. She said she was mindful and conscious, words that describe awareness, not agreement. She said she'd resolved to put duty before any others, a formulation that explicitly acknowledges other considerations existed. Feelings she was overriding, a future she was burying. Peter Townsend would later write that their love took no heed of wealth and rank and all the other worldly, conventional barriers which separated us. A beautiful sentence, and a useless one. Love takes heed of exactly those barriers when the barriers are enforced by crown, church, and parliament simultaneously. That statement was the last time Margaret was permitted to address the matter publicly. No follow-up interview, no clarifying remarks. No Oprah sitting across from her in a garden asking how it really felt. She issued her words, and then she was expected to carry on. The British public praised her. Noble, dutiful, selfless. What nobody pointed out, what it would take decades to recognize, was that the system had engineered this outcome from the start. The 2-year separation, the posting to Brussels, the escalating consequences, the final ultimatum. These weren't the unfortunate byproducts of a messy situation. They were deliberate actions by an institution that identified a threat and eliminated it. Margaret wasn't making a free choice. She was surrendering under conditions designed to ensure her surrender. And what the system promised Margaret implicitly was that if she followed the rules, she'd be taken care of. She'd have a role, a place, a life that honored her sacrifice. What the system actually delivered was destruction. In 1958, Margaret met Anthony Armstrong Jones, a fashionable society photographer who straddled bohemian London and aristocratic country houses with equal ease. They married on the 6th of May, 1960, at Westminster Abbey, in the first royal wedding ever broadcast on television, an estimated 300 million viewers worldwide. Armstrong Jones was created Earl of Snowdon. For a time, the marriage looked like it might offer Margaret the unconventional happiness the Crown had denied her with Townsend. It didn't last. Whether it was ever really meant to is a question biographers still fight about. Was Snowdon a genuine love match or the most spectacular rebound in royal history? Both conducted affairs. Both could be devastatingly cruel. Snowdon was rumored to leave notes around the house, cataloging Margaret's failures as a wife, placed where she'd find them at her most vulnerable. Margaret's relationships included Robin Douglas Home, a nephew of the former Prime Minister, and, most notoriously, Roddy Llewellyn, a landscape gardener 17 years her junior, whom she met in 1973. The crisis detonated in February 1976, when the News of the World published photographs of Margaret and Llewellyn on the Caribbean island of Mustique, looking relaxed and intimate in bathing suits. The tabloids went nuclear. Within weeks, Margaret and Snowdon announced their separation. In May 1978, their divorce was finalized, the first royal divorce since Henry VIII and Anne of Cleves in 1540. And here's where the cruelty compounds. The same press that had praised Margaret for giving up Townsend in 1955 now turned vicious. She was the party princess, irresponsible, selfish, a burden on the taxpayer. Nobody connected the dots. Nobody pointed out that the woman drinking too much and sunbathing with a man half her age in the Caribbean was the same woman who'd been told at 25 that her love was unacceptable and her feelings were irrelevant. The tabloids treated Margaret's decline as a character flaw. It was a consequence. The entirely predictable result of a life where compliance was demanded but never rewarded, where sacrifice was expected but never acknowledged, where every avenue of genuine self-determination had been closed off since childhood. Her body started failing with a grim momentum that felt almost allegorical. Margaret had smoked since her teens, one small, socially acceptable rebellion the palace tolerated because it didn't threaten anyone's position. In 1985, She had part of her left lung removed. In February 1998, on holiday in Moustique, the same island that had featured in her greatest scandal, she suffered her first stroke. More strokes followed. In 1999, she badly scalded her feet in a bath, an injury caused by the loss of sensation from the strokes. From that point on, she was largely confined to a wheelchair. The image that haunts the end of this story is from August 2000, the Queen Mother's 100th birthday celebration. Margaret was wheeled out for the cameras, visibly diminished, her face drawn, her body a fraction of the glamorous woman who'd once been the most photographed princess in the world. She was 69 and looked decades older. The woman who'd been told she was too dazzling, too dangerous, too much for the institution to handle, now sat at the edge of the frame while the cameras focused on her mother. Princess Margaret died on the 9th of February 2002 at the King Edward VII Hospital in London after a final stroke. She was 71. And in one last irony that feels almost scripted by someone with a taste for cruelty, her death was eclipsed within weeks when the Queen Mother died on the 30th of March 2002. Margaret was cremated, and her ashes were placed in the King George VI Memorial Chapel at St. George's Chapel, Windsor Castle, alongside her father's remains. Even in death, the spare took second position. Even in death, she was overshadowed. Now, Harry. But only for a moment, because the point isn't Harry, the point is the pattern. Harry was born the second son. He fell in love with someone the institution rejected. He was told, in ways explicit and implicit, to choose between love and duty. He recounted in Spare that his father reportedly said to Diana on the day of Harry's birth, "Wonderful, now you've given me an heir and a spare." Whether the quote is precisely accurate doesn't really matter. The dynamic was real. Margaret knew that dynamic in her bones. But here's where the stories diverge. And this is the part that should genuinely unsettle you, regardless of which side you're on. Margaret obeyed. She gave up Townsend. She stayed inside the system. She followed the rules. And the system destroyed her. Slowly, methodically, over 47 years, until she died in a hospital bed at 71, having never escaped, never told her story, never had anyone call her brave for what she'd endured. Harry rebelled. He chose Meghan. He left. He moved to California. He got the Netflix deal, the Oprah interview, the best-selling memoir. He's alive. He's free. He's also exiled, controversial, and permanently separated from the family he grew up in. So which one got it right? That's the question this story leaves you with, and it doesn't have a clean answer. Margaret's obedience didn't earn her peace. It earned her a miserable marriage, public humiliation, tabloid cruelty, and a wheelchair at 69. Harry's rebellion didn't earn him peace either. It earned him freedom. But freedom laced with estrangement, public division, and the knowledge that he can never fully go back. What's undeniable is this: the system didn't learn. 50 years separated Margaret's crisis from Harry's, and the institution produced the exact same problem with the exact same mechanics. Elevate one child, subordinate the other. Give the spare all the constraints of royalty, and none of the purpose. Then act shocked, genuinely shocked, when they break. Margaret couldn't tell her story. She had no mechanism for it. No social media, no sympathetic long-form interviews, no $100 million production deals. The press of the 1950s was deferential to the crown, but pitiless toward Margaret personally. She had a palace-approved statement, and then decades of silence. Harry had every platform the modern world could offer. Margaret had a drawing room and a cigarette, and the slowly dawning understanding that nobody was coming to rescue her. Nobody called Margaret brave. Nobody made a documentary about her sacrifice. The establishment saw her obedience as baseline expectation, not heroism, just compliance. She did what she was supposed to do, and the reward was being allowed to remain. She remained. And that's Margaret's story. Not Harry's prequel. Not a footnote in someone else's rebellion. Her own story, lived in full, inside a system that asked everything of her and offered nothing in return except the privilege of continuing to serve it. The last public image of Princess Margaret is that wheelchair at her mother's birthday. A diminished woman at the edge of the frame. She'd followed every rule, given up her love, stayed inside the institution, and the institution let her wither in plain sight. Harry is in Montecito. He's got a Netflix deal and a best-selling memoir, and his kids growing up in California sunshine. Whether that's victory or exile depends on who you ask. But Margaret? Margaret never got to find out what the other choice looked like. She made her decision on the 31st of October, 1955. And she lived inside that decision for 46 years and 101 days, until her heart stopped in a London hospital, and the spare was finally, permanently, released from service. The question isn't whether Harry was right to leave or Margaret was right to stay. The question is why, after watching what obedience did to Margaret, watching it in real time, within living memory, the system still expected the next spare to shut up and take it. And the hardest question of all, did they even notice what they'd done to her? Or had they already moved on to the next crisis, the next inconvenient second-born, the next love that threatened the brand? Margaret's silence answers that one for you. Subscribe for more stories like this.